It feels to me like what is happening in my country, Trinidad and Tobago, and parts of its diaspora right now is this unquestioning welcome of US imperialism. And when citizens speak up and say, hey, maybe we should be cautious about these people's intentions based on their track record and maybe focus on making life better for our own people, then we get this backlash and stoking of pre-existing divisions to paint anyone who is against the current agenda as the enemy. Now, because I'm currently researching the apparent contradictions in the socio-political attitudes and values of people in my community, Indo-Caribbean people, and how this relates to our mental health and well-being, it was very important for me to go and reread Frantz Fanon, a Caribbean thinker who wrote about the colonial psyche or the psychopathology of colonization. He was born in 1925 in Martinique and died very young under strange circumstances, but that's a whole other topic. But his ideas were influential all around the world as formerly colonized societies contended with what it really meant to be free or independent. As you might realize, we are still trying to figure that out. So even though I hadn't looked at Fanon since I was in my 20s, I'm realizing that he is now more relevant than ever. And many of his ideas help us to understand what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago. So first is this idea of internalized inferiority. Colonization spanned many centuries. Some might argue that it hasn't stopped, but rather that the center or metropole has shifted from London to Washington, D.C. So this long period of time perhaps gave us an inferiority complex because the language, ideas, and ways of the colonizer were centered, and those of our ancestors were diminished. Now, some people might say, well, it seems like some ethnic groups have a superiority complex when it comes to looking down on other groups. My belief is that this is also an inferiority complex, because if we are positioning ourselves as, closer to the colonizer and looking down on others, for that, we're still seeing ourselves as inferior to the colonizer. We're still centering their entire worldview. So today we still defer to those ideas, even to our detriment sometimes. So they might come up with this concept called narco-terrorism, and then we just repeat it and don't question it. We just accept that it makes sense, perhaps because we don't trust ourselves enough to do otherwise. Next is the idea of mimicry. This comes from another post-colonial scholar from India, Homi K. Bhabha, who was directly influenced by Fanon. In his book, Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon wrote about how the colonized adopt things like the dress and the speech of their colonizers in order to access prestige or opportunities. And some would say that a key part of our carnival in Trinidad and Tobago is exposing the ridiculousness of those among us who act this way. But today, our government flagrantly adopts the speech and the governing style of the metropole. To be clear, this is not the first government in our country to do that. Perhaps all of them since independence have, to some degree. It just feels like the stakes are especially high right now. And one important thing that Bhabha said was that mimicry is inherently destabilizing to formerly colonized countries. And if you look around, that does appear to be the case. Next is this idea of misrecognition. So the idea here is basically one of demonstrating our worth by receiving recognition from the person whose standards deem us unworthy in the first place. So one way of doing this might be positioning yourself as not like the others in your inferior group. We can see this among Caribbean migrants who vote for policies that are harmful to migrants in general and to people who are not white. Another way this might manifest might be by going against a regional body which is calling for peace in the region and instead siding with the aggressor. It's kind of like, look at me, I'm not like them. A kind of political pick-me-ism. Then there's the very important idea of the national bourgeoisie. In his book, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon predicts that independence can produce a local elite governing class who are basically like a local version of the colonists. So they don't develop our capacity to be autonomously productive, self-sufficient, sustainable. Rather, they continue the relationship of extraction for external benefit. So is that happening right now? Finally is the idea of displaced aggression. Fanon was a psychiatrist and wrote about violence from that perspective. So we carry the aggression of centuries of powerlessness and coercion and humiliation. Not that that is our entire story, right? Because they have always been those among our ancestors who stood up and fought back. But that was a big part of the story. And Fanon said that we tend to direct that aggression that we carry horizontally towards each other rather than vertically towards power. So we don't ask who manufactures and profits off of the guns that we use to kill each other. We don't ask who benefits from an economic system where most people can't meet their basic needs while a few live in luxury. We don't ask why our natural resources enrich powerful nations. That's too dangerous to think about. Instead, it's easier to blame other ethnic groups or religious groups or migrants to our country who are fleeing difficult circumstances in their own countries, or even our Caribbean neighbors.